Hey everyone, so today we're going to be covering the Mark 6 Ford Transit. I've been asked this a few times about the vehicle going slow, so I'll cover that in today's video and what the problem is and what I've come across over the years. So stay tuned and keep watching to the end. So the problem is you basically lose your power. So from what the vehicle used to operate, you lose a lot of power and the vehicle doesn't pull uphill as it used to. And you'll find that the vehicle is limited to 3000 RPM and it'll struggle to go above that engine speed. So that's the main problem, is the lack of power. So there are a few fault codes that give an indication as to what the problem is, and I'll put that up now. Notice how the engine has a bad rattle and it doesn't idle properly. These are also symptoms of a failing diesel pump, although it can also be related to the injectors and the timing chain, but keep watching. So we're here in a Ford Transit. This is the year 2004. So this applies to any Ford Transit that's manufactured from 2000 right up to about 2005 is when they switched it over to the Tdci engine. So this has got the Tddi, so the turbo diesel direct injection. It's the early type Bosch pumps. This is a Tdci engine. So here you can see that it's got the common rail with the high pressure sensor on this side, and notice how the mechanical lines just go to the side, and it's got electronic connectors. So it's got electrical connectors on each of the injectors because they're electronically controlled. So that's the difference between a Tddi and a Tdci. So this is the Tdci engine. This particular vehicle is fitted with the 5-speed gearbox. You might have a 6-speed. So we'll go out to the front under the engine bay and we'll show you how to identify what you have. So first and foremost, it's easy to see here, you've got direct injection if you've still got this top cover. But the easiest way to tell is look up here at the injectors. If they got these mechanical lines with no electrical plugs on it, that means it's a direct injection. It's a mechanical type injection system. From my experience, these pumps do play up. Realistically, the easiest way to solving the problem is just to replace the complete unit, the pump. So looking here, the pump lives down there. And most of the time, if your vehicle's done over 100,000 miles, and if you have the following fault code, which I'll put up, that usually indicates that the pump is faulty. It doesn't mean that the pump is faulty. It could be something else that's playing up, like the injectors or the timing of the engine has jumped. But most of the time it's the pump. But I'll show you how to eliminate all the problems. So this is the long way of doing it, but in my opinion, this is the best way if you're doing it yourself. Like I said, my way is a bit longer, but it's a safer way of doing it. So what you want to do is you want to start by removing this whole front clip. Once you remove the full front clip, then you'll have access to the engine like you can see in this clip right now. So then you can remove the front timing, the metal case around the whole engine, and then you can inspect both the timing chain for any slack, the tensioner, and at this time as well you get easy access to the diesel pump without the special tools that you require, which I cover later on in the video. So remember, it's very important to set this engine in time. As long as you set this crankshaft at the factory marks that I showed you earlier. So watch my other video how to see how to set this particular crankshaft in the factory setting. So with the lines and marking this off. So as long as this is set there, these pistons will only be halfway through here, so that it's in service mode. So once you set that in service mode, the pistons will be here, so you can rotate these camshafts. Even if you skipped a tooth, you can still rotate this camshaft back. But make sure, like I said, make sure this is locked here, and make sure it's locked in the rear as well. From the gearbox, you'll have to go at the back there through there. Watch my video which explains that. It'll be in the description below. So for the diesel pump, this vehicle's already got the timing cover pulled off. What you need to do is you need to pull off the intake manifold, as you can see here. So those are the bolts there. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 bolts that will stay on the manifold, so you don't need to worry about dropping it. It's basically within that plastic manifold, so there's no concern of that. You'll have to disconnect your high pressure lines. So what I suggest is disconnect it from the top here and pull it out from here. So you take this one off and take that one off, the brackets, and you just pull them off, and then you you can pull it off the rear of the diesel pump as well. This one was done a bit differently. So once you do that, and the only reason you take off your front cover is if the chain is stretched, or if you want to check that as well, which I highly recommend. Otherwise, the other simple procedure, you should see a picture now, is you just take that cap off on the front timing cover, and then you access these 3 bolts which hold on the gear of the diesel pump. So just over here, there's a plastic cover here that you need a special tool, which I'll explain a bit later in the video. So once you take that off, then you get access to the 3 bolts over here. So that's how it looks. Normally the diesel pump sits at the back there, and the bolts are over here. So you take off the gear bolts, and then you'll get access to the diesel pump bolts, which are here. So once you take that off, then you can go ahead and remove the bracket. So there'll be a bracket as well at the back here that holds on the diesel pump, and you'll have to take off the connector to the ECU, to the little control unit on top of the pump as well. So you'll have to take that off. So this is the intake manifold that I was referring to over here. So these are the bolts. So as you notice here, they don't fall out. And the procedure is when you get a rebuilt pump, I'll explain that a bit later in the video, what you have to do. But this is just, and it's quite common for these manifolds to gunk up quite a bit, as you can see here with the EGR being pumped back into the system. So you might want to give this a good clean as well. So that's a good idea as well to do that. So normally what I recommend is, if your Ford Transit's done over 150,000 miles, or say over 220,000 kilometers, you would want to, and if you do experience your Transit going a bit slower, which is a common sign that the pump is playing up, or if there's a misfire, that's also another sign of the pump playing up. What I would highly recommend is to take off this front cover and just check the chain, because sometimes it can stretch. This is a dual type of a chain, so it's a dual runner type chain, so it is quite strong. Most of the time they're okay, but from my experience, after about 200,000 kilometers, because of the heavy duty use on Transits, they do tend to stretch a little bit. So when you do replace the chain, let's say like with a genuine Ford kit or a BGA kit or something similar, it improves the performance, and the motor starts first pop every morning. So that's a good idea as well. And so another tip I would suggest is, while you're in here, you might as well replace your glow plugs. That's over there. So that one there, and there. So before touching the glow plugs and before starting this job, I recommend spraying some penetrating fluid or something like WD-40 or similar. Soak it in there several times in a week and drive the vehicle around. This will basically break up any rust and allow you to pull out those glow plugs. Otherwise, from experience, you will strip the glow plugs in the head, and then you will have to tap them out, which is another big job as well in itself. So that's another thing to keep an eye on. And that's another tip. And finally, the other point is over here, these injectors tend to rust because of this cowling over here. It's supposed to drain from here and go through here at the bottom and go out, but the problem is this windscreen over here, when a lot of water collects in here, it still comes out and drips from this drain over here, this area, and it drips basically onto the injectors. So that's another point, another tip that you could possibly watch out for your Ford Transit, especially if it's a motorhome and you're keeping it for some time. You'd want to make sure you dry this area up, or just maintain this area, get rid of the rust, spray some protectant or something similar. I also recommend taking off the whole front clip over here, so that it gives you easy access to the timing chain and all the timing components, especially if you're doing a large job like this with the diesel pump, the chain and everything else. It's not too hard to take off the front clip. So when you take off the radiator, you just drop the cross member, which is normally here. So the cross member will be just bolted there. So those two bolts there and those two bolts there, it comes off with the intercooler. So that just drops off, and then the radiator can just be pulled out. Fairly straightforward. The viscous fan, once you pull this front off, you can leave it in place and pull it out. It's just over there, those three bolts on the viscous fan. So the viscous fan is just held in by 3 bolts. So it goes here, those 3 bolts through the cover, just bolts in like so. So that can be unbolted once you pull out the radiator, because that will come out pretty straightforwardly. You can watch my other video on the water pump or the crank seal and how to do that, and how to see how to take off that viscous fan if you need to. So this is the TSB by Ford. You'll see it in both the slides. So it's pretty much what we're discussing today. Once you have your new pump installed and you've reinstalled the timing chain, if you've done it the longer way, and you've set all the timing marks, it's very important to put everything back together and make sure you've not missed anything. Put the bracket back for the diesel pump, put all the injection lines back in place, make sure you tighten them properly to spec. Watch to the end, the torque specs will be at the end. Connect up the pressure lines. So for the from the fuel filter, make sure you replace that as well. So once everything's back together, and if you've drained the oil, make sure you've refilled the oil. Make sure your coolant's topped up. So once all that's done, do not start the vehicle. Make sure you have a good healthy battery in place. And even if you've got a battery charger, this is the time you want to connect it up. So connect it up to the battery. And what we want to do is turn on the ignition and leave the ignition on for at least 10 to 20 minutes. Because what happens is when you get a rebuild pump, the ECUs are flashed and they become virgin ECUs. So what you want to do is when you leave the ignition on, it starts to communicate with the immobilizer and the ECU from the vehicle. So do not at any point allow the battery to drop below 12 volts. This is why I mentioned about the charger. And do not turn off the ignition. So leave it, even if you want to leave it for 20 to 30 minutes, depending on where the pump has been rebuilt. There has different instructions, but generally speaking, I usually leave it for 10 to 20 minutes if you're not using a scan tool to sync up the ECUs. And that's usually enough time for everything to communicate. I know a lot of y'all will probably say that you don't even have to, you just leave it on for a couple of minutes and that should be fine. But if you're doing this for the first time, I highly recommend leaving it on for at least that longer period of time, just to make sure that everything is synced up. And once it's all done, then you can turn off the ignition and then you can turn it back on, and then you can start the vehicle. Bleed out the coolant. Make sure there's no air in the injection lines as well. There's a bleed out procedure, which I will explain in another video if anyone's unfamiliar with that. And then from there you should be good to go, and the vehicle should be running fairly smoothly. If you have replaced the chain and the pump at the same time, it'll almost run like a new engine. So I've added these diagrams here to assist anyone in bleeding out the fuel system when the pump is replaced, or if the injectors are replaced. So this covers both the injector replacement and installation, and all the torque specs. If you have one of the more powerful transits, you'll have a lift pump. So if you have a lift pump, it makes the life a lot easier as well. You can just cycle the ignition key on a few times to activate the pump. This will bring up the fuel to the fuel filter, and it'll push most of the air out. But just refer to this diagram and all the diagrams you see, and watch to the end of the video as well. There's more useful information there. Moving on, this is the front disassembly process. So the front of the engine, the front cover, the intake manifold, the pulleys, and so on. So it's got all the torque specs and everything. Like I said, I've done the front end clip removal. Just refer down to the description below. The video is there, or in the comments. And for the front cover removal, just follow this for all the torque specs and the diagrams if you need it. Make sure you watch to the end, because I've got useful information about the TSB for the solenoid on the diesel pump, and I covered that as well. The harmonic balancer, or the front engine pulley, might be a little bit difficult if you're not familiar with how to remove this and how to lock it. So I've also got another video where I cover the seal replacement. So if you're struggling on that part, just make sure you just check out the description or the comments below. They're all linked to each other, and it shows you exactly how to remove that front pulley if you don't have specialist tools, or what to use, and how to replace the seal as well. So that's quite important because it's a special seal. Once you complete the removal of the front cover if you're doing it the way that I suggested. Now you'll see the next set of diagrams which discusses the removal of the diesel pump. So if you've done it this way, the way I've just discussed, with the front cover removal, you don't need any of the special tools because you'll have easy access to the sprocket of the diesel pump and all the bolts. If you're doing it the way that Ford said it, and you're confident that the chain and everything else is in good condition, then you will need the special tool to open up the front cover. So these originally were a metal front cover, but they superseded and they became a plastic cover because there are frost issues and getting seized up on the cover. So this you will see in points 6 to 10. So this is where the special tool is used. And again over here, Ford covers the bleeding process of the injectors and of the diesel pump, which I've put in the previous slides as well. I put a more detailed version, so keep watching and you'll see the next part of the video, which is quite important. So here we have a VP44 Bosch pump. This is the part number in case anyone is curious. So that's a genuine number and that's the Ford number. So the vehicle that this pump came off had the symptoms that I've described previously, and it also had the fault code, as I mentioned at the start of the video. Now one thing to note is with these pumps, they have their own ECM or control module here at the top. So it's that sort of a control module. Now this one has been stripped down and this one was sent to a specialist to investigate and check the pump, and it was deemed that the pump needed to be rebuilt. So you could consider this pump like an engine. They do wear out over time and they can be rebuilt. It's something at the end of the world, so to speak. They can be rebuilt. It's normal wear and tear with these pumps. There's a plunge and an internal system, which I'll put up a quick diagram now, so if anyone's curious, you can see that. So all these parts do get worn, so you can't help it. Now, I discussed the electronic control module here on the top. The reason why I mentioned that is most of the time you won't get a check engine light display on the earlier Ford Transits. So there won't be a check engine light, so you won't know that there is a fault of sorts. But you'll just notice the drivability issues, which I mentioned earlier, with the vehicle going slow and not going above 3000 RPM. So those two fault codes normally relate or correlate to the fuel injection pump. However, if you had recent work with the timing chain or anything to do with that, any recent engine work, I would get that checked first, because if it ran fine before that and you had that work done, and then all of a sudden you've got low power, don't deem the pump is the main fault, because there could be other areas that could have had a malfunction. So check that first before, or like I've done here, just pull out the pump, send it to a specialist, let them bench test it, and then you can determine whether the pump is at fault or not. That's why in my earlier method I discussed about removing the whole front timing chain and everything and investigating it, because normally it's a good idea to get that also checked out. And a replacement timing chain does make the engine start a lot quicker when it's cold and run a lot smoother, so just keep that in mind. The chain does stretch over time, and then the tension also gets worn out. The guides also get worn out, so just keep all that in mind. There was a TSB on these pumps by Ford. So there's a timing solenoid here at the bottom at the back. Now that TSP consisted of the fault code P01. So that fault code corresponded to this timing solenoid being at fault. So in order to test this, so this one actually wired into the ECM like so. So if I turn it around, you notice here it's actually widened. So you actually, to test this and to replace it as well, you need to actually snip the wires from here. And now the location of the pump, now the pump sits on the engine block. So if you're looking at the front of the engine, it just sits below the head on the engine block, and it's held in here by 3 bolts with the gasket. So 1, 2, 3, and the sprocket is held in by the 4 bolts over here. So this is where the timing mark or the drill bit goes into. So this is the solenoid, and this is the part number for it, and this is what it looks like. Now from experience, these are quite difficult to pull out because these O-rings, and it also rust over here underneath. So I would advise, if you're trying to replace this with the diesel pump in place on the vehicle, you'll have to remove a few things just to get to it, and then you can soak this down, but it is quite difficult to do that. And from most of the vehicles that I've come across, this is usually not the fault. So I'll show you how to test it using a multimeter. So as you can see, I've just set the multimeter to 200 ohms. If you've got an auto ranging multimeter, then you just set it to automatic. And now I've got one lead connected up to the side of the solenoid, and I'm just going to touch the other one. So we want a reading roughly between 10 to 20 ohms, give or take, because your multimeter will have some inconsistencies and some inaccuracies. So as you can see, this one's perfectly fine. The next test is we want to go from one of these wires to the body just to check the resistance. So for that, when you're on 200 ohms, just quickly check that. If you see any reading, that means there is a short somewhere, so that solenoid is faulty. So now, as you can see, there's nothing at 200 ohms, so I'll just switch that up to the meg range. So I've gone to 20 mega ohms, and now in 20 mega ohms we should get a reading, as you can see. So this solenoid is perfectly fine. So that's how you can test the solenoid and deem if that really is the problem and needs to be replaced. So now we'll discuss replacement of the pump. So like I said, there's 3 bolts over here. Now there's a couple of alternative ways in how you can remove it. So method number 1 is what I've discussed already about pulling out the front timing case, so the front timing cover, and then removing the sprocket and then removing the pump. That way you check both the chain, you check the tensioners, you're checking the guide, and you can get easy access to the pump from there. The other way that Ford have designed is just from the front cover using the special tool you'll see now. All you have to do is remove that cover, turn it anti-clockwise, open it. It's just a metal cover with a gasket. That gives you access to the sprocket and to these 3 bolts. Once you remove the plastic or the steel front cover that covers up the diesel sprocket, the injection pump sprocket, once that's removed, you want to go ahead and make sure that you set the timing. So you can use the big nut if you need to on the diesel pump to set the vehicle into the timing marks. So through that center round bolt that I showed you earlier, you can lock out the pump, so then you know it's set into timing. And then you want to install the special tool. So that special tool just basically installs in the same way as the cover came off. So you install it, and all that does is it holds the sprocket in place. Once that's held in place, you can go ahead and remove the bolts of the sprocket and the bolts of the diesel pump. So the main idea of this special tool is to make sure that the sprocket doesn't fall internally, so that's why it just holds it in place.